starvation, I see increasing poverty, and I see increasing conflict arriving from these things. And actually, those are all health issues. Health around the world has always been driven by poverty and starvation and conflict, not just by malaria and diarrheal disease and so forth. We concentrate on CO2, of course, but there are a whole raft of greenhouse gases, some of which are released in vastly smaller concentrations of CO2, but that have very, very much greater warming effects. So some of them are measured in thousands of times the warming potential of CO2. Methane is probably around 23 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as is CO2, and you say its half-life is short. The problem, of course, with methane is that it's also part of a positive feedback loop. So methane hydrates are frozen into Arctic tundras, and as we warm and we thaw that frozen soil, those methane hydrates are released. Now they contain well over twice the total carbon content in the entire world's atmosphere. And that sort of pulse, even if those gases could have a short half-life, that sort of very rapid pulse of something with 23 times the greenhouse gas warming potential of CO2 is a positive feedback which we can't build into our modelling with ease. That's the problem with these things. Our models often don't build in these unexpected positive feedbacks. So methane, yes, rapid reduction by things like changes in land use and changes in how we use things like cattle, very important indeed, but we've also got to keep our eye on the ball that it's also part of a positive feedback that's very, very dangerous, and we can't control that without slowing down warming from other sources. So I'm at the, I suppose, the high-tech end of medicine, which is relatively meaningless in terms of public health, I appreciate, and I struggle with that sometimes because, trying to save some lives is not perhaps the same as saving others. I suppose the reason I remain with it to a degree is that I'm not a good politician. I'm not good at political process, which is why I don't think I can stand there and throw stones at politicians and tell them they should do better, because I don't know how that works. And neither, oddly enough, do I want to stand there and throw stones at fossil fuel industry particularly. They are where they are, and they have a responsibility to shareholders to make money. We need to help them make their money in a different way. And we need to do that aggressively in urgency. If we just harangue them without offering them that other market, we can't expect them to change. It's unreasonable to expect them to change. But we do need to urgently assist them in making that change.
Everybody knows about forests and the importance of deforestation for climate change. So everybody is talking about it at this climate summit and implementing policies to reduce the emissions from deforestation. But few people know about the emissions from peatlands. Peats, the material in swampy areas where the plant material falls in the water in oxygen-low acid water and remains there for hundreds and thousands of years. This peat is now having huge stocks of carbon. Globally, there is more carbon stored in peat than twice the amount that is stored in the forest of the whole world, 70% of the global atmosphere. So if this is released, we have a real big problem. Well, the bad news is this peat is now rapidly decomposing, burning, mines, and is just converted into carbon dioxide. So we are facing a disaster. Globally, 3,000 megatons of peat carbon are released every year. 3,000 megatons of carbon dioxide every year again. That is 11% of the total amount of all global fossil fuel emissions. That is enormous. This amount is increasing rapidly because in many areas of the world the swamp areas are drained to enable logging for the timber, to enable agriculture, to enable, for instance, in Southeast Asia, pulp plantations and palm oil plantations, crops that can't stand water. So they drain the area to enable the agriculture, and by draining it, the acid, oxygen-low water disappears, and the peat that was stored like pickled onions is just exposed to the air and will react. carbon in the peat react with the oxygen in the air to carbon dioxide. And this is taking place very rapidly, especially in the tropics. Especially Southeast Asia is notorious for this. Only from Indonesia, 2/3 of all those emissions are released every year, 2,000 megatons. Because Indonesia is cutting down its swamp forests, its rainforests and peatlands. They drain the area to enable equipment to enter the area, to lock the trees, to take out the Meranti and Ramin trees for our furniture. After that, often the same companies continue the drainage and they drain the area till 1 meter deep to establish plantations for palm oil, for instance. Palm oil, used as a biofuel in many Western countries and subsidized as a green, environmentally friendly biofuel, is produced in those areas. Under those plantations, with a drainage of a depth of 1 meter, we see that every year 10 centimeters is just evaporating, disappearing in the form of carbon dioxide. If you look at the 1 hectare, this is an emission of 100 tons of carbon dioxide from every hectare every year after year, till all the peat is disappeared. This is of course a disaster. This 100 tons of carbon dioxide are just released to enable a palm oil plantation that just produces 6 tons of palm oil a year. 6 tons of palm oil a year, but the production costs 100 tons of carbon dioxide. This is not a green fuel. It is worse than mineral oil. It is worse than coal. It's worse than anything. So countries should stop supporting those biofuels. Countries in the Western world should support countries like Indonesia to maintain and manage their peatland areas very well, because those carbon stocks are too precious and to prevent a disaster. And countries really should give money to the communities in poor regions in the peatlands to manage their areas in a way so they can keep the carbon in the soil. That is a global problem, and you can't expect a poor local community to solve this problem.
Morning, my name is Nyoman Suryadi Putra. I'm the Technical Director of Elands International Indonesia. So currently we have a project, something related with the rehabilitations of the mangrove habitats in Aceh. So Aceh, one of the countries in the Asian countries, have been affected severely during the tsunami. So in Aceh we are working together with WWF Indonesia, and this project funded by Oxfam Novib, Netherlands. Yeah. So we started the project in year 2005 in August, and it will be last in December 2008. So far up to now, we've planted already almost 2 million mangrove seedlings, also including the beech tree species, which is Casuarina. So from 2 years working in Aceh coastal areas, up to now, we were able to sequester almost 12,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So hopefully in the coming years, more carbons will be sequestered because the plant keep growing up. So that is about Aceh. In Aceh, we are working with the local community which were affected by the tsunami. Yeah, so we provide them with the small grants. Yeah, so they can start it with our small grant to start their livelihood. But at the same time, we were asking them to plant mangrove seedlings and also the beech tree species. Yeah, so the project will last until next year. So the second thing I would like to raise here, it is about the peatland. Peatland, Indonesia has the largest tropical peatland all over the world. Yeah, we have almost 21 million hectares of peatland, and our peatland stored so much carbon, even though the above ground of the vegetation is already degraded. So the below ground carbon that we calculated already, it was about 125 gigatons of equivalent carbon dioxide. So we urge very much that the people attending these conventions to really take care about peatlands, of the tropical peatlands, because so much carbon being stored. Yeah, so we have problems annually because of this kind of peat fires, because of the drainage, yeah, because of the illegal loggers activities, and then we have problems with the peat fire. And then according to the recent findings, our peatland emitted so much carbon, mainly from the burning, about 1.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide emitted annually because of the fire. And then currently, in Central Kalimantan, we have a project called Central Kalimantan Peatland Project, and the project carried out together with the consortium consisting of the University of Palangkaraya, WWF, CARE International, and also with the local government. Yeah, and then from that project we will try to to rehabilitate the peatlands by blocking the canals. By blocking the canals, actually we try to rise up the groundwater table. By raising the groundwater table, we try to keep the peatland wet. So by keeping the peatlands wet, that means the peatlands will be very difficult to get fire. So by doing this, we do hope that we can save a lot of carbons during the dry seasons.
And quite correctly, I think about the impact of ideas on actions and on our culture and society as a whole. I want to look for a few minutes at where we get our ideas and how we might change them. What underlies the fact that we are having a conference on ecology where the major nation of the West, along with its allies in large part, are the people whose minds we cannot change. How is it that it is so impossible to make the United States, for instance, understand the crisis we're in and their relationship to the rest of it? I want to look then at Western ideas, religious ideas, and how those religious ideas are affecting both our economic principles and our scientific choices. Jonathan Edwards wrote once, "Saints do not see things others do not see." On the contrary, saints see just exactly what everyone else sees, but they see it differently. What does the West see? And how do they see it? That brings them into meetings like this and puts them in tension with what seems to be so commonly conscious to so much of the world. As Richard said, we know the situation. We know that we are in a period where what we see is a vast and complicated and crucial and obviously skewed world around us. We're losing, talk about asking animals and trees for forgiveness because we need to cut down a tree to build a house. We are destroying an average of 200 million animals a year for research on cosmetics. 2/3 of the hungry of this world, for whatever reasons, because the earth isn't producing or there are no trees there, 2/3 of the hungry of this world are women. 2/3 of the illiterate of this world are women. And 2/3 of the poor of the world are women. That can't be an accident. That has to be somebody's policy or philosophy of life. That this is a part of the world that you can feed last, house last, educate last, and free last. Where do we get ideas like that? How could we possibly live in this society and say there's something reasonable about that? We can rupture the placenta of the earth and sit back and not worry about it. We can watch the polar ice cap going and change the channel because it has nothing to do with us, and we can send our delegates to meetings like this, and we will go on choosing long-term profits over, or short-term profits over long-term treaties. We're using chemicals to activate the soil, and they're now depleting that land as well as poisoning the water that we need to grow those things. We talk about defending our security, and we're using and creating nuclear weaponry designed to destroy a greater part of the earth, and we have the effrontery, the arrogance to call that defense. How do you do that and then trumpet treaties that have left the annihilation industry completely intact? What we have managed to eliminate is 1% of the nuclear arsenal of this world, and yet we don't see trouble. If those are the ideas that we are throwing into the universe, no wonder we have had 16 conferences on climate change. Not because we don't have the scientific data, but because the ideas that we are formed in the West have got to be changed. Now, I'm going to argue that these ideas are intellectual ideas. They are not simply spiritual ideas. They have spiritual impact, but they don't come out of our best spiritual understandings of the spiritual nature of the cosmos. And yet, we are in a world where, in my country, in a world filled with the obscenely poor, we are also filled with churchgoers. Now, there's got to be a disconnect between what we say is the spiritual life and what we assume is also the civic life into which or out of which we build our spiritual concepts. We haven't reached the point, clearly, of seeing differently. I'm not sure that we are really at the point, however many conferences we've had, as a people, of seeing at all. There was an essay written in 1960 by Lynn White Jr. The name of the essay is the Historical Roots of the Ecological Crisis. That essay was perceived as a kind of theological heresy. It is now taken, it's a classic in the development of theological thought. What did Lynn White say that shook the religious world? White wrote, "The major problem facing the modern world is that the Judeo-Christian ethic justifies domination." The major problem facing the modern world is that the Judeo-Christian ethic justifies domination. In other words, White was saying that what people do or fail to do about ecological issues depends on what they have been taught to think about creation, about themselves, and about their relationships to the things around them as a result of their thinking about the nature of God. So, for instance, if water has no meaning except for my comfort as a human being, then I can dam it up and drain it off. I can drown it in oil and waste and tin cans until it chokes the fish and poisons the children without even having so much as the grace to blush. And that is precisely what we do. We have not just separated ourselves from nature. That would be some sort of civic fault line. We have distinguished ourselves from nature, but more than that, we have made nature our product to manipulate. We have taken the ownership of nature. We don't see it. Now, the question is why, and I believe that the religious foundation for this problem in the Western world, as you move from one of these meetings to another, lies in the fact that the Western world in the Judeo-Christian tradition has chosen to choose one creation story over another. Like most religions, there's more than one creation story in Western theology. The one most of you would know, I bet, if you raised your hands, is the one you learned in Sunday school someplace about Adam and Eve. They're put in the garden, and the ancient tradition translation says, to fill the earth and subdue it. Why are we here? What's our purpose? To fill the earth and subdue it, to take it and keep it, to keep it and steward it, to have it and use it. As a result, with that attitude that we are here to subdue the earth, we begin by losing our balance. We have forfeited our spiritual perspective. You can't sit around in a room and talk about spiritual perspective on the one hand when you are feeding it with some sort of theological barriers or obstacles to the spiritual life and the sustenance of the earth itself. We have put ourselves, in other words, this most religious people, in spiritual peril. When you realize that, you realize then that the Judeo-Christian ethic is, as a matter of fact, the most anthropocentric, the most human-centered of all religions. It begins by centering on the creation of humanity. They didn't talk about the flowers, the first day this, the second day that, the third day this, the fourth day that, and then you. Now we got to what counts. Now we got to what's going to do it right. Here sits the crown of creation. I am looking at it. Then it proceeds by glorifying it, and it ends with concern solely with the redemption of humanity. There is never any talk about what will happen to the earth, except that it will burn up, blow away, but you and I will stay. Those ideas are very clear. We teach that creation is a series of stages, and that each one is higher than the one before it. When you teach that, if you allow that idea to seep into its most logical viewpoint, you're saying then that humanity outranks the universe in splendor and achievement. Whatever you do is enough. This is God's answer. Secondly, we say, man, the male, is the crown of creation. We have built a pyramid, and up here sits the male. Now we know that's true because men have told us so. There isn't any doubt about how this system goes together. We've got somebody at the top of it whose rationality has brought us to this point. Whose rationality has brought us to this point. So if a woman weeps over it, if a woman cries about it, if a woman aches about it, we say women are like that, they're unreasonable. 3, we say God planned the world for human benefit. It's just this big cornucopia of Thanksgiving gifts, and you can have as many as you want. It's all there for us. Its purpose, the whole purpose of the planet itself, is to sustain our creature comforts, and it's eternal. It will always keep producing for us. That's what its purpose is. What are we worrying about? This is a blip. This is a blip on the cosmological screen. This is just a little temperature change. This is for us. Nothing bad is going to happen to it. Number 4, we teach we own nature. It belongs to us. And so finally, number 5, we say the function of this earth is to serve man's purpose, whatever that scope, whatever the end of it. That means then that we can now assume with confidence that humans are above nature. We're not nature. We're beyond nature. Despite the fact that as the top of the food chain, we'll be the first to go if pollution continues at the rate you can measure it tonight. Well, it's a neat picture. It's a tidy picture, but it's very partial in a world in which 30% of us consume 80% of the world's resources and somehow or other diminish the rest of the human race. That was the first creation story. There's a second one. Now the interesting part of ecclesiastical gossip here is that the second one was really the first one. Somebody along the line put this second one first. I have a funny feeling it was for their economic advantage then, too. What's the second creation story? You remember this one, too. This is where Scripture says, the Judeo-Christian Scripture says, God brought the animals to Adam for naming. Remember that one at all? That was hardly touched. It's hardly ever preached from a pulpit in the West. It's almost never exegeted. But when they do exegete it, they say, now what this means is that by giving the human being the right to name the animals, that's the sign that the human being got power over the animals. I love asking a lay audience, how many in here have children? Anybody in here have children? Did you name any of them? Did you get any power? No, you bet you didn't. You get a little less power every single day. I don't care what you named them. The whole notion that it's a sound theological exegesis to say that this was simply another way of proving that the human being has power over every other living creature has got to be at least a certain degree of nonsense. So we have then a story in which the animals are brought to Adam, I would argue, to indicate the relationship between the human being and nature. The honest-to-God, caring, loving, responsible relationship. You don't name animals that you take into your family. The animal that you take into your family becomes part of your family. You take responsibility for that animal. You develop personal relationship. You would indeed say to that animal, if you had to kill it, thank you for what you've done. It breaks my heart to take this. But I know that this is the connection between us and that you would give your life for me. You have two creation stories. The first is the story that explicates a theology of domination. It's all yours. Do anything you want to with it. Argue with every COP conference. Tell all of the smaller nations that this is your decision. You bought the mine. You own the diamonds. You get the oil. They're all yours. The second creation story gives you the theology of relationship, of responsibility, of ownership and care and love and sustenance and for an eternal understanding. It's beginning then to move your churches, to move your scriptures, to move your own minds, to teach your own children, to see that this theology of domination is what really is the spiritual demon in resistance in this conference. And until churches begin to emphasize not simply recycling, but God's purpose in putting us into relationship with nature, we're not going to change any minds. That legislation won't hold up. You'll be having COP conferences until your great-great-grandchildren are coming. COP 1762, and nothing has happened yet. Somehow or other, if we're going to be spiritual people, if we have any respect whatsoever for the way God works with humankind and the word that God has given all of us in our scriptures, then it's time to look up the second story. It's time to see what it says about eating organically, about what it says about not destroying the earth, about eating what you have in front of you. It is not a theology of domination. We have to choose between these two, and we have to know that the one is reckless and the second one is relational. Saints do not see what other people do not see. Saints see just what everybody else sees, but they see it differently. It's time for us to open up our scriptures, open up our churches, open up our spiritual counseling groups, and begin to see who we are a little different. Because if we don't get this story, we're going to be the first ones to go. That your presence here is a sign of grace. It's a sign of holiness. It's a sign of goodness breaking through. It's a sign of this call of God in the human heart. Find your second creation story and yourself in it, and the world will be saved. You're not going to do this with science. You're not going to do it with math. You're not going to do it with oil. You're not going to do it with money. You can only throw the thought out into the universe that we are to be in a love affair. Think about the nature of God, the nature of creation, the nature of our relationships, the nature of the cosmos. Theology is a thought process. Spirituality is the way we choose to live because of what we believe. Now you see a lot of threat in the major religious traditions because they don't like people using the word spirituality. Spirituality says, I don't know if you're thinking what you ought to think. So until somehow or other the theological basis for what we do somehow or other, we talk about sustainability of the earth. We have to sustain a spirituality that is an earth-centered spirituality, because that is our obligation to the creation. Theology is not something you can just throw away. It's a dangerous subject, a wonderfully dangerous subject, because it changes hearts and minds. But you've got to look at the one you were given and decide if your theology and your thoughts about science are relative. Do they match?
In one of the discussions or workshop I attended, somebody made the remark that if climate was a bank, it would have been rescued a long time ago. And I think that it's a very crude remark, but it really sums up what is valued in the society. That we, the West, everybody preaches about that we're on this catastrophic path, but no one is willing to sacrifice anything. But we're willing to come up with money out of thin air to save banks, 600 billion and plus others. So I think it really speaks to how do we get that shift in awareness? How do we get the masses of people to really come to grip with this, about our miscalculation or misvaluation of what is important, what is essential to life, and what it is that we need to actually save and give up to save what we value, or we say we value.
Yes, I really mean it. You know, I honestly mean it. That I believe religion legitimates when you accept as your creation story a story about domination, and you define it. You define domination as your spiritual purpose and reason for existence. I mean, nobody's going to use that word in so many terms, but when you say fill the earth and subdue it, that's what you're talking about. I want to know, I think you need to go to the UN designers and definers of COP16 and ask them, why is this the only conference in my memory on this subject that introduced even the notion of the relationship between spiritual ideas, scientific ideas, cosmic ideas, and economic ideas. I think you ought to be having conferences for pastors, writers, preachers, and teachers, and ask them how they are dealing with this topic. Churches are staying away from this topic like it's a plague. They'll tell you, well, that's not our question. That's a political problem, or it's a scientific problem. No, it's not. Every one of these speakers tonight have told you it's a spiritual problem. And I'm not sure this is coming through the churches at all. I think that we have to call the churches to their own responsibility to deal with this topic as a spiritual question. And then when, and I don't mean to imply that you do it first and you hold everything else, but until we see that all we're doing, all this conference is doing, is maintaining the notion that the two things are separate. And they're not. Until the spiritual religious community as a community comes on board across all traditions and says, this is what our scriptures are about, and this is what we say, you are not going to know why you can't get people to agree on these issues.
Hi there, I'm really happy to be here today to tell you about one of the impacts climate change is having in the ocean that really hasn't had as much focus as I wish it and I hope it will have in the future. So climate change has three impacts in the ocean. It causes the oceans to warm, it causes them to become more acidic, so decrease in pH, and it also causes them to lose oxygen. And so today I'll be focusing on the loss of oxygen from the oceans. And we know that scientifically as ocean deoxygenation. And so the ocean actually takes up more than 90% of the heat that's produced from anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And when the ocean warms, it has some really important consequences, like deoxygenation. And unfortunately, this is a fairly new problem. Even scientists have only started addressing it in the last 20 years. and so it hasn't received quite as much attention. But oxygen is fundamental for most life. We breathe oxygen, fish breathe oxygen through their gills. Pretty much all of the organisms you see in that coral reef require oxygen to live, and so oxygen is very fundamental. However, climate change actually causes oxygen levels in the ocean to decrease, and that's mostly due to warming. And we've actually seen that in the data. Globally, we have seen that the oceans are losing oxygen, and we've already seen biological consequences of this oxygen loss, because again, oxygen is very important to support life. And the groups that are most sensitive to loss of oxygen are actually fish and crustaceans. So crustaceans being our crabs and our lobsters. So these are the groups that are really important for our fisheries. And so that's why a lot of countries should actually be interested in what's going on with oxygen loss on their coastlines and in the open ocean. And so let's just take a moment and take a breath and think about what's in the air that we just inhaled. So about 21% of the air that you just inhaled is oxygen. And as Carol Turley will tell you, there are two lungs on this planet. One of the lungs is the terrestrial lung, and it's producing about half of the oxygen, and the other lung is our ocean lung. That's all of the algae that grow in the oceans, and that's producing 50% of the oxygen we breathe. So a lot of the oxygen that we're getting is actually coming from all of these small phytoplankton in the ocean. In the ocean, there is oxygen, but it's there in a dissolved form, and it's much harder to get out of the water for marine organisms that live in there. And oxygen content in the ocean is dependent on the temperature, the amount of mixing that's occurring at the surface, and then the biology. So biology produces oxygen through photosynthesis, and it uses up oxygen through respiration. So we respire, and all of the organisms in the ocean also respire, thereby using oxygen. And climate change has a negative impact on all three of these. And so we'll just do a little intuition building so we can all become comfortable with why climate change would negatively impact oxygen levels in the ocean. So first of all, warm water holds less oxygen. We can do many experiments in the lab. It's a very simple physical property, and we see that when temperature increases, the amount of gas that water can hold decreases. And so because of that, just simply when you warm the water, it's going to be able to hold less oxygen. And we can actually see this in the lab, but then we can actually see this in the data from the ocean, where the tropics in light purple are areas with low oxygen, and the tropics are the areas with the lowest oxygen at the surface, because warm water can simply hold less oxygen, whereas polar regions have higher oxygen content just because of the property that cold water can hold more oxygen. And then warm water is harder to mix, so when you get warming at the surface from climate change, it becomes more difficult to mix that water. When you can mix more water, you can get more oxygen into the water from the atmosphere. When you can mix less water due to that warming, you get a stratified water column. That means that everything outside of that mixed layer is no longer in contact with the atmosphere. And a lot of biological respiration is going on at those mid-depth levels. So if you can't mix the oxygen in there, it's going to get depleted much more rapidly. Another reason why warming leads to more oxygen use is because when it's warmer, you actually breathe more, you respire more, you use more oxygen. And so that's what's going on in the ocean with all of the organisms that live there. The ocean is full of bacteria, so there are about 1 million bacteria in every milliliter of seawater, and all of those bacteria are utilizing oxygen. So that, and when the temperatures increase, you also get increased respiration. And so a lot of times you get increased respiration in areas where there's high productivity. So whenever you have a big algae bloom, for example, and once the algae bloom sinks out of the water column, it gets decomposed by all of those bacteria, and that leads to a reduction in oxygen. So whenever you get increased nutrients, whether that's through sewage runoff or fertilizer runoff, or whenever you get increased nutrients due to upwelling, so coastal circulation, nutrient-rich water coming up, you're going to be in a situation where you have high surface productivity and then more decomposition at depth. And so coastally we have a lot of hypoxic areas. So hypoxia is simply defined as an oxygen concentration that's detrimental to life. So in most areas, most organisms can't live in a hypoxic zone. Some are specifically adapted for it, but most animals can't live in those areas. And so in red, you can see all of the coastal hypoxic zones. There are more than 400 identified now. And so these usually correspond to areas with dense populations. And so these are primarily driven by a lot of nutrient runoff from our farms, from sewage. And so most parts of the world with dense population have these coastal hypoxic zones. And so if you actually go on Google Earth and you go into Google Ocean, you can take a look to see all of the hypoxic areas that have been identified in your own area. So that's us at the National Stadium, and you can see the Baltic Sea actually has quite a few hypoxic zones. There are also open ocean low oxygen zones. We call these oxygen minimum zones. And they're naturally occurring there because we have really nutrient-rich water at the surface. And once we have high productivity at the surface and it sinks down and gets decomposed, it utilizes a lot of the oxygen. And so we have these large oxygen minimum zones, particularly in the Pacific. And so in this map, everything that's not gray is a part of the ocean that has hypoxic waters. And so we see really large areas of that in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and then we also have hypoxic areas off of the west coast of Africa. And so where these hypoxic zones actually butt up against the continental margins, that really impacts our fisheries because a lot of our fisheries target the continental margins. And these are large areas where most fish that we like to fish can't live. And so the total hypoxic area on the continental margins, so a lot of the places we like to fish, it's greater than the area of Poland and France combined. So you're really talking about large areas where most fish that we like to fish can't live. And so not only are they large in area, they're about 8% of the total ocean area, but they're also very deep. So you can have parts of the ocean where you can have 1,000 meters of water that's hypoxic, which can't support most normal aerobic life. And so one of the main points is that this is a very widespread problem, and probably whether you have a coastal hypoxic zone due to runoff or you have an oceanic zone due to your or an oceanic low oxygen zone due to your location, most coastlines actually have a low oxygen problem. And this low oxygen problem gets exacerbated when you experience surface warming because of the properties of how warming affects oxygen content in water. And so we've actually seen in our data that there has been a decrease in oxygen, and the new assessment, IPCC Assessment 5 report, actually predicted that by the end of the 21st century you'll see a 3 to 6% decline in global oxygen levels in the ocean. But this is just an average value, and so what you actually see in this graph, in the blue, on the top panel in the blue, you see areas that are already low in oxygen, and then in the second panel, in the blue, you see the areas that are going to lose the most oxygen and have lost oxygen already. And what you can see is that the areas that are already limited on oxygen are the ones that are losing the most oxygen. And so that's important. And you can actually see the expansion of these low oxygen areas through the water column. So between 1960 and today, you can see that the depth occupied by these low oxygen hypoxic areas in the water have expanded. And so what that means for us on the coastlines is as these areas expand, they also shoal, so they become shallower. They get closer to our coasts, and our coasts now actually face this low oxygen water that is coming up and affecting some of the fish. And we've seen off of the coast of California in the last 22 years a 21% decrease in mean oxygen content at about 300 meters, and coastally a shoaling of about 100 meters of the hypoxic layer. And so where the depth of the hypoxic layer is what really affects a lot of your coastal organisms. And so what we can see when we look at physiology in the lab is that there are certain groups that are most sensitive to low oxygen. And we can look at this in terms of lethal concentrations, and so what causes an organism to die, or we can look at this with sublethal concentrations, so what causes an organism to grow less or to reproduce less. And we can see that for both of these, crustaceans and fish are our most sensitive groups. And we can see that in the lab, but we can also see that in the field. We have mortality events, large mortality events in the Gulf of Mexico. When you get a hypoxic area, you have a low oxygen event, you have dead fish. This is a really fast impact. We also see that off of the coast of Africa where there's low oxygen water that shoals. Crustaceans, lobsters will just walk out of the ocean because the oxygen is too low for them, and you'll have a widespread mortality event. And so we can see this most recently off of Oregon, where before the Oregon coastline did not have a lot of anoxic and hypoxic events, But recently, since 2002, because of the shoaling of this oxygen minimum zone and this low oxygen water, they've actually been experiencing a lot more low oxygen mortality events. And starting in 2002, they saw 75% mortality of the Dungeness crab, which is a really big, important fishery off of Oregon. And then also in these ROV surveys, you can see a healthy fish community prior to 2002, and then pretty much all of their ROV surveys after 2002 saw a lot of dead fish and invertebrates along the bottom because of these low oxygen events. And so what that means for the greater ocean, it results in habitat expansions and contractions. So there's some organisms that actually really like low oxygen because they've been adapted to it through evolutionary time. So this fish on the right actually does great with very low oxygen concentrations. And so organisms like that will see their range expand. But organisms that need high oxygen to survive, and so those are our tunas, our billfish, they actually are experiencing habitat contraction because all of a sudden they can't use as much of the water column as they did previously. And so we've already seen a 15% reduction in the habitat of tuna in the Atlantic because of the expansion of these low oxygen areas. There's also been a decline in mesopelagic fish. So these are small midwater fish that are really a very important component of the food web. They feed everything at the top levels of the food web, and so they're very sensitive to low oxygen. And then also we've seen habitat expansion of the Humboldt squid. So the Humboldt squid can do well in low oxygen conditions, and it actually has expanded all along the west coast of the US. And they compete with hake, and they also eat hake. So the hake fishery has not been doing as well, but the fishery on Humboldt squid has been doing better. And so a really important point is that low oxygen areas are carbon dioxide maximum areas. Whenever you use oxygen, you produce carbon dioxide. That's just through respiration. And so whenever we see an area that's low in oxygen, it's always high in carbon dioxide. So when we see the shoaling of these low oxygen areas, we actually see the shoaling of very low pH water. And so that's exactly what we've been seeing off of the west coast of the United States, where some of the water that's coming up is 7.6, 7.75, very, very low pH. And what that also means is it has very high CO2 concentrations. And so some of these waters are 1,200, and for example, surface is 400 parts per million. And so this is actually water that is net fluxing carbon dioxide out of the water instead of taking it up. So there are some important feedback implications. So we really need to pay attention to ocean deoxygenation because it has very important biological effects. We know that it's declining, and we know that it will decline in the future with surface warming. And we know that it probably will have some important impacts for a lot of coastal economies. However, because it's such a new topic, it really hasn't had too much of a focus, and it didn't make it into the summary for policymakers, even though it's really a problem policymakers should be thinking about because it can impact their local economies. And so small changes in temperature can have very drastic impacts on oxygen content. So just a 1 degree increase in surface warming will triple your suboxic zones and increase your hypoxic areas by 10%. We know that it has profound consequences on biodiversity, on fisheries income, and we know that it also has environmental feedbacks in terms of greenhouse gas emissions because a really potent greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, is produced in low oxygen areas. And in the historic record, we actually see that oxygen depleted areas in the ocean are very tightly correlated with warming periods. So we know how this works in the past. And so with that, I would just like to say thank you for listening to this presentation. And I'm here as a part of a group of Scripps students. We're graduate students, and we really want to try and communicate our research to more of a public policy audience as well as a public audience. And so there's more information about how climate change is affecting the oceans at this website, oceanscientist.org. And also there's an oceans booth here, 102 on this floor. So if you have any other questions about ocean impacts of climate change, please come and talk to us. So thank you.
Architecture is both kind of like one of the biggest responsibilities to carry when you consider the human development and the effects of human development, when you consider urbanization, population growth, the need for further and further and further development. And when you acknowledge that sort of the resources that are being consumed, wasted through construction, demolition processes, all of this, and you consider energy and climate change and carbon, etc., through the operation of buildings. The responsibility upon the architects has changed in profile. There is no longer that kind of art for art's sake. We actually have a greater responsibility, and whilst the need for art is there, and make no mistake, our cities need to reflect our aspirations, they need to reflect our society, they need to reflect what is good about human creativity and nature. There is another layer of thinking that has to be brought to architecture in this current world, in these days now, which is a very much a social and an environmental responsibility that cannot be shirked and has to be addressed. And I just want to convince as many young up-and-coming architects as possible to think about architecture as a very, very important role player in the world going forwards, in terms of that responsibility, both in an artistic sense and a scientific sense, in terms of performance and everything else. There's an old modernist architecture axiom that talks about form follows function, and I prefer to think in terms of form follows flow. And I think about that in terms of the way the sun energy flows across a site, the way wind flows across a site, water, even people, even money, even all sorts of things. So one can sort of underpin a design in its social, economic, environmental context by considering the various different energies that are flowing and how to harness the power within that in order to generate architectural form and meaning. So it's very much context-based. So I teach, and what I try to impress upon my students is that there's kind of three role players, in essence, in the architect's visualization or understanding of a project, and that would be the physical context of the project, so the piece of the planet whereupon it's going to happen, whether that be urban, rural, or whatever. That piece of earth will have various different attributes and sort of qualities about it. Then there's the brief or the program or the client of the project, and their needs out of the project is a very big design driver that architects can actually use to generate form, obviously. And then there's the architect themselves and what they bring to that process in terms of their identity, their worldview, their philosophies, their creative impulses. So it's sort of a very nice process whereby I see the architect as kind of like a matchmaker between a piece of ground and a client with a need, but that matchmaking happens through a very personal engagement with the project by the architect, bringing their own sensitivities to that project. We have a world now, and we have this thing called climate change, and the reality is that 40% of climate change is actually caused by architects. 40% of the world's energy is used in the operation and maintenance and production of buildings. So I point the finger at architects and I say it's your fault. And then I understand that, particularly in South Africa, architecture is being taught the way it was today, the way it was when I was a student. And what I'm saying is that there needs to be a complete and utter paradigm shift in the way that we understand architecture. Once you realize, or you point the finger at architects and say it's your fault, then something has to give, something has to change. So what I'm really sort of quite passionate about is bringing a, sort of dismantling this ivory tower idea that architects have, that they are these wonderful creators who visualize these beautiful constructs and they get realized. And I think, the way the world is heading is that in actual fact buildings should be designed around a table with a whole bunch of different expertise, including biologists, sociologists, physicists, and, as well as engineers and architects and everywhere else. But again, bringing in that sort of systemic understanding of design and problem solving. And it's not really about creating objects anymore. That's like the time for that is gone. Yes, there are huge aesthetic and meaning and identity responsibilities on the architect to create beautiful buildings, but beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that is a sort of subjective debate that can go on forever. So what you can do is you can justify a design through process, through an understanding of what it is that you're doing and how you arrived at that solution. And provided that there is a sort of a sensitivity and a sensibility about aesthetics and about composition embedded in that understanding, then you should be okay. And that's kind of like where I try and focus my work and try and focus my teaching, that I try and bring to students a new methodology of architecture whereby they can actually explore these contextual issues in a lot of depth, and out of those issues they can draw a systemic understanding of how the building needs to operate and what it needs to produce or do or provide, and those considerations are then the generation of form, and through that generation of form the architect brings a sense of identity and meaning and purpose to that resolution. So it's a quite a different kind of approach where there's a lot less ego involved and a lot more subtlety in sort of the generation of form and identity in architecture. Students are so keen to learn this stuff, and that's in South Africa there just is not the capacity amongst the teaching staff. They don't know. They know what they were taught and they've practiced the way they've taught, which is about meaning and identity and art and creativity. And what I'm saying is, that's all critically important, but there's absolutely another layer that has to, everybody's running around designing vehicles with square wheels. That's what it basically amounts to. They're beautiful, beautiful cars, but they've got square wheels and they don't actually work. We've got office buildings in Joburg that in winter they get heated up in the morning and they get cooled down in the afternoon because they're so designed not around performance, around the idea of creating comfortable spaces inside with an outside environment that you have to understand and take into cognizance. So I see that outside environment as a resource, as a system of energies to use, to harness, to create comfort inside. Whereas most architects see it as kind of like an enemy that has to be shut off, and then we switch heaters on and we switch air conditioners on and we make this false environment on the inside. And that's not necessary. There is this filter, this relationship that could be developed between the inside and the outside of buildings, between the internal climate and the external climate, in terms of creating comfortable spaces that meet human needs for comfort and shelter. That's the biggest problem. That is the biggest problem, is that we actually need we need to intervene on those buildings in very, very clever ways, and that's not always very easy. But it can be done, and that's actually where I want my research to start going, is to start saying, okay, it's easy to design this perfect city on this green field site and reimagine how Joburg could have been developed, but this is how it is now. So how do you apply the same thinking at a building scale, at a room scale, at a street scale, at a neighborhood scale, at a district scale, at a city scale? How do you kind of reimagine the current infrastructure being messed with, eroded, sort of attacked, modified to be more responsive to the overall systemic understanding of what's going on? So that's kind of like where I'd like to take my work. The way I often talk about my buildings is that they sit in a landscape and they relate to that landscape very much, or they evolve in that landscape during the design process, very much the way an organism evolves in its ecosystem. So they tap into the available resources and They concentrate on cyclic relationships, and these things are exploded up from an ecosystemic, traditional ecosystemic understanding to a more sort of to a more human contextualized ecosystemic understanding. So things like money, aspiration, purpose, meaning form part of that contextual relationship that the building positions itself within and responds to. There was one project where the client came to me and his objective was to have a house that was independent of the city council and was autonomous, what we call an island home. And because he didn't have trust or faith in the city council in the years to come. And that was the statement at the beginning of the project. By the end of the project took 2 years to design, and by the end of the design process he was a completely converted environmentalist, and he had taken on all of these other softer tissue agendas about responsibility, custodianship, and etc. So that was really a fantastic kind of process. Also, he was a very wealthy man, and he spared no expense at achieving his objectives, which is an incredibly high performance house. It was a private house, and one which was autonomous, so it makes its own electricity, it makes its own water, it treats its own waste, etc., and it's in a suburban context here in Johannesburg. And so that was like quite an interesting project, and what was really fascinating about that was the kind of aesthetic ideals or the aesthetic identity that came out of that design process was very much a performance-based concept, again realized. It could have been realized in any number of ways. So the way it gets realized is influenced or shaped or sort of pushed by both my sensibilities and the clients. So it was quite nice in that sense, and yeah, and for me it's a nice project, and I was really fortunate that to be given that opportunity to actually work something through right to the very nth degree of realization. So it was a very satisfying process, and kind of like it was from there that my interest then moved on to cities, because I kind of like felt like, okay, that's cool, nailed it, time to get on. You know what I mean? My interests have quite largely, or are busy largely moving from understanding buildings in this way to now starting to look at cities in this way. And in fact, I'm kind of like starting to research and focus on the idea of how we as people can develop sustainable cities which respond to this contextual understanding of ecosystemic, in terms of natural environment, human-made environments, things like politics and economics. I'm very interested in biomimicry, and there's the biomimicry. There has been a city designed upon biomimicry principles. It's also been used in Cape Town for the upgrading of certain areas. So those kind of projects one finds really interesting. I don't, I kind of like take a slightly different slant to that, because as an architect, my interest lies in a whole range of influences and aspects that drive a design process, whereas biomimicry is really very specifically focused upon a specific kind of methodology, whereas I've kind of developed my own methodology, which would include things like biomimicry, sustainability as understood in various different ways. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of architects that I look up to, although I'm notoriously bad at remembering names of projects and people. I mean, Norman Foster is somebody who I think I really sort of kind of like admire the way he approaches projects. Ken Yang, Renzo Piano. So these guys kind of have they have a very natural way of developing a design, which in a way, one kind of conceptual understanding or solution for a project enables a whole range of different factors or considerations that they are encompassing, and I think that that's a really kind of nice way to think about architecture. What I really kind of like push against, what I really don't like, is this very sort of form-based, the creative impulse that many architects have to build monuments, basically what I call monuments to their own egos and their own creativity, and these sort of sculpturesque objects. And I don't see architecture as objects in space. I see them as an organism that ties into an ecosystem in a whole range of different ways. And it's very kind of like monodimensional to think of it as an object. And very seldom do I have an idea of what the shape or form of this building should be. It usually evolves out of a process. And I'm very interested in that, in how the aesthetics and the design look and feel can actually evolve out of a sort of a methodology which is very much kind of like science underpinning, the science of the performance of buildings and the ecology of buildings, underpinning a kind of a conceptual, artistic, personal impulse to generate, you always have some kind of a personal idea of, the same solution could be solved that way or this way, but you prefer this way, because I prefer to think of that in terms of what other options does it open up, what other design opportunities does this option or that option open up. But nevertheless, there's always some kind of materiality or sort of ideology or philosophy or aesthetic that underpins the sort of objectives that you're aiming towards in the design of a building. My whole theory about cities that I'm busy working on basically kind of like looks at ecosystems, natural ecosystems, and how organisms evolve within those ecosystems. And whenever conditions change, you'll see certain species die out, or certain species will proliferate and prosper and flourish up to a certain point, but then when they reach over a critical point and they start actually damaging the ecosystemic whole, they start to die back. So nature has these wonderful sort of self-governing mechanisms. And it's basically all built around water. I mean, essentially that's the bottom line of human existence. So, in a physical sense. So my kind of whole idea is really looking at cities in that same way. So, for example, municipal boundaries would be demarcated by watersheds, and each municipality would be responsible for the management, the collection of rainwater, the management of that rainwater, the recycling and the delivery of fresh water to its own watershed area. And as soon as development had reached the limits of that water carrying watershed area, that's it, that's the limit to human development in that area, and now another watershed must be colonized for further human development. So you never overstress any one system too much. And then other cute little ideas, like at the bottom of this watershed would be the collection dam where all this water sort of ends up, and the municipality offices would be located right there. So the first people to know about the water going bad or starting to smell wrong or this sort of thing would be the municipality themselves, and their biggest functionality is in fact the management of the quality of that water. So if human development was organized around the principle, for example, of water, and land boundaries were organized with that sense, we could start looking at sustainable cities. And similarly, movement and transport in cities. I mean, the easiest way to walk up a mountain is to walk up the way water comes down a mountain. You follow the river up. And similarly, our sort of transport and the sort of the mechanisms by which we sort of move stuff around in our cities can be reinterpreted. The way we do roads, the way we do electricity, obviously should be. There's this idea that in biomimicry, for example, that solutions should be nested and modular. So the idea of every single building being a power plant, producing electricity, using it, storing it, delivering it, sharing it, that's the sort of sensible, like plants in a natural environment. They all have symbiotic relationships with each other. They all provide services to each other. And one can imagine that same sort of thing in buildings and cities, where and where one actually focuses. It's sort of systemic thinking, where, because since the Renaissance, we sort of developed this silo thinking, where now you're either a doctor or you're a lawyer or you're a biologist or you're a physicist, and what we're sort of realizing now is that actually what's much more important is the relationships between elements rather than the elements themselves. So systems thinking is now concerned about understanding those relationships, and I think for me that's what makes good architecture, good urbanity, is understanding a systemic sort of system that whole entity sort of develops and lives within and propagates and is designed around, and those are the sort of design considerations. So kind of like that kind of says it all in a nutshell there.
We are from GeoAgro Africa. We do satellite monitoring, crop monitoring through satellite imagery. We monitor crops on a daily basis, where we can actually tell you if there's any stress on your plants, crops on a daily basis.
How do you manage that? How do you tell whether there's stress?
We do through infrared imagery.
Yes.
We can actually, if a plant's in stress,